everyone needs accommodations. Everyone falls into some bucket. Single parent, going through a divorce, first generation college grad, caregiver of someone with a disability, or caring for an aging parent. There are so many different things that affect our personal life that also affect our work life. How do we normalize this process for all the variety of things that people could need at work and normalize the process for everyone? By doing so, we not only help companies get set up to support this next generation of the workforce who are expecting personalization, regardless of disability status, we also level the playing field for people with disabilities by normalizing this process for everybody.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Many of us need something a little different to thrive at work, whether it's flexible hours or mental health support or a quieter place to focus. But most of us don't ask for it because we're afraid it's going to make us look weak or difficult or defective. And that silence hurts businesses as much as it hurts employees. Charlotte Dales is the co-founder and CEO of Inclusively, and she's built a platform that helps employees privately request the support they need without stigma, while giving businesses the tools to personalize work for their best performance. In this episode, Charlotte and I explore why benefits often miss the mark, why Gen Z is driving the push for personalized work, the most common needs that employees keep secret, and how even tiny personal changes can transform work for everyone. All right, if you enjoy listening, hit subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Now, here's my conversation with Charlotte Dales. Charlotte Dales, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you for having me.
So on the show, we talk a lot about the design of work. That's what the show is about, is why we should design it better and how to design better. We talk to a lot of designers. And one of the themes that really recurs is that we need to be able to respond to the variety of what people really want from work. And that it's challenging because if work's a product, as we frame it, how do you build a product that can satisfy such a great range of needs? And so in your current company, Inclusively, I feel that you're serving one part of that. And that's what I want to talk about, which is the variety that comes through as neurodivergence, but it's also disabilities. And I hesitate to say the word, and we'll talk about that. So let's start with the big story, which is how many people have disabilities that might require accommodations at work for them to feel and be successful?
Traditionally, and today with the company's existing processes, around 3 to 5% of people actually disclose that they have a disability to their employer so that they can receive accommodations. And predominantly, this is usually people with visible disabilities who need physical accommodations. And it's trending more into mental health and neurodivergence. But from when the ADA was signed 30 years ago, that's been the thing that people always thought about at work. But we know that 30% of the existing workforce today meets the federal definition of having a disability. So that's a huge gap between the people that are actually disclosing it and everyone who is potentially quietly suffering at the company and doesn't even realize what resources might even be available if they did disclose what they needed. But if you think about this next generation of the workforce, these numbers are going up dramatically year on year. Over 50% of Gen Zs identify with having at least one learning difference, mental health, neurodivergence, or some other disability. They grew up, firstly, as you talk about work as a product, they grew up in an environment that was highly personalized to them from day one. Nobody is looking at the same thing. No one is looking at the same ads. You do not have to watch a TV show at a specific time anymore. And this generation is really the first generation that grew up that way. So to one point is they just expect personalization at work when they show up there too. But more importantly, they grew up in an education system where they were diagnosed much earlier, much more frequently with things like learning differences, mental health, neurodivergence, and other disabilities, in addition to becoming accustomed to advocating for themselves within the education system. And those things don't just go away because you now are in the workforce. And so we can already see it with the data that over 50% of this generation are identifying, whether it's publicly to their work, they're identifying anonymously with one of these things. So we already knew the number was big between the delta of who discloses and who this actually could apply to. And this next generation is even widening that gap.
Yes. And I have to say, when I read the statistic that you provided, which is that 53% self identify as having disabilities, and this is essentially Gen Z. So this is not everybody in the workforce, but it's the emerging workforce. I don't think they're using the same definition of disability that I am, because a couple of different things is that seems like such a high percentage. And because the statistic was phrased as self identified, more than anything, it made me wonder, what is the definition of a disability? For that statistic to make sense with what I know about people, what I think I know about people.
Well, so you bring up a good point. I think traditionally people were not thinking about ADHD and dyslexia and mental health challenges and neurodiversity for one. Maybe neurodiversity, people bucketed some of those things like autism into the disability, what they think of as disability. But dyslexia, ADHD, all of these things are covered by the ADA. So it's covered under the law, firstly. But secondly, they're all things that people are receiving accommodations for in their education system. And so I think because of the increased awareness and discussion around mental health at work, in addition to the increase and earlier diagnosis of learning differences and also mental health and other neurodivergence, that number is surprising when you're thinking of it from the lens of those things not being included, but probably isn't surprising when you think of it with those types of disabilities being under the umbrella.
And I can imagine, for instance, if we just skipped over the word disability and said people needing accommodations at work to be successful, to be as successful as they could possibly be, then I would be very comfortable. I mean, obviously, if the statistics say it, I'm going to trust it more than my personal opinion. But that would make me say, yeah, no, I think a lot of people could use accommodations at work.
That's what we expanded to. So we started rooted completely in the disability space, covering the larger umbrella that I discussed, but we started within the disability space. But what we noticed is that everyone needs accommodations. Everyone falls into some bucket. Single parent, going through a divorce, first generation college grad, caregiver of someone with a disability, or caring for an aging parent. There are so many different things that affect our personal life that also affect our work life. And our view was, how do we normalize this process for all the variety of things that people could need at work and normalize the process for everyone? And actually, by doing so, we not only help companies get set up to support this next generation of the workforce who are expecting personalization, regardless of disability status, we also level the playing field for people with disabilities by normalizing this process for everybody.
Why don't people want to talk about it?
Stigma. And oftentimes, I think people have the misconception that people with disabilities or people who are caregivers or any of the other examples I gave, that they know what they need. So why aren't they asking for it? But people are missing that they may know what challenges they have, but they might not know what they're actually asking for of the company. And they may not know that some technology you provide actually could serve as a accommodation for the pain point you're experiencing. And so I think it's one, there is definitely still a fear of stigma and of retaliation that once you do it, the train's left the station. And now you're wondering every time anything might go wrong, did it have to do with that? But secondly, why would I want to disclose personal information about myself if I don't even really know what's going to happen after the fact? And I don't necessarily know what I'm looking for the company to do.
I know I would absolutely hide it. I would never, in an interview, for instance, admit to any special need that might throw off the deal. It would be very, very scary.
An example there, though, I think you're totally correct. But where this can become an issue is you may need an interview accommodation. One of the largest accommodations that we found when we first started in the disability space on the hiring side for interview accommodations was prefer not to have a panel interview. There's a lot of people who are neurodiverse who preferred a one on one conversation versus having to present in front of a panel. And if you think about it, maybe there's some roles where actually public speaking is important. But if you're applying for like an engineering role, should you have to demonstrate that skill set to be able to be an engineer? Probably not. And if you're not requesting that accommodation, it actually can hurt you from getting the job by actually not setting yourself up for success. But there's tons and tons of fear on that. One of the things that's interesting on our end is we started as a hiring platform. As I said, 3 to 5% is the average disclosure rate. That number is probably close to zero when you talk about in the interview stages. But on our platform, we had about 80% of people were disclosing what accommodations they needed, both for the interview and on the job, aware that if they chose to do that, that got submitted to the employer. But the reasons they were comfortable doing it on our site is because they know that all the employers that were looking were actively trying to access this untapped talent pool. But it goes to show that there are ways to shift people's mindset that don't necessarily mean from our platform. It's how you present yourself as a company.
So I'm going to talk about your platform for a second. I want to explore that for a second. And then I want to continue because we're going to be using it as an example. And so I want to be able to have everybody understand what it is as we go through. And I'm going to say what I think it is.
I would love that.
It's a place where people can go who feel that they might need an accommodation. They don't even have to know that. But it's a place that people can go and find ways to identify accommodations for themselves. It's something that exists inside the company and organizes all the resources so that I can go and say, I'm really nervous in front of groups. And I could go there and I might be able to find any of the resources that are in the company, which otherwise might be just blowing around on the intranet someplace. And now I've got them all there, sorted by my particular concern. What I didn't realize is that that's something that could be extended to potential candidates as well. And so that's what it does. Is that accurate?
I'd say it's very accurate. I think starting the process anonymously means anyone can put in anything about themselves. And then we're deducing what pain points have we identified and serving up all of the products, benefits, services, policies, processes, accommodations. We're basically aggregating all of that really fragmented data and investments that companies have made. They've paid for a lot of things that are going unutilized. And we're serving it up to people, as you said, based on their unique needs. I'd say the one other added benefit to our platform is that we're also capturing all the data of what is coming in by way of needs and able to identify what are the most commonly searched for, what are the most common phrases that are happening where you don't have a resource for, so that you can start to make investments based on what people are really needing and looking for, and also reroute investments from where you maybe have invested in something that no one is actually identifying as a need. And I think when you think about benefits, every company you ever talk to says, we invest in all these benefits and no one uses them. And it's really hard to know, is it because you just invested in something that no one needs? Or is it because it doesn't get presented to them at the right place, at the right time, in the moment that they need it? Our process is essentially not just doing that for benefits, but for everything you've invested in and serving it up to people at the right place, at the right time when they're actually looking for something. So it can actually really answer those questions for you on the investments you've made. Is it because people don't know about it, or is it because they don't need it? So I'd say just the data side helps people optimize what their packages are in the future as well.
And I assume that when I come to this product as an employee, I don't have to have a self-diagnosis already. I can come and say, here are the kinds of challenges I'm facing.
Yes. So you can say, I feel anxious at work, or I am a caregiver for a child with a disability and struggling with my flexibility, my schedule. What you don't even have to have a diagnosis or a problem. You can just say what you're experiencing. And then we're sort of mapping that to the world of possibilities that are available at your company, in addition to supporting content on maybe your company doesn't have a resource, but here's free content or free tools that you can access.
It's interesting. I did some research in preparation for this to find out some of the employment stats for different kinds of, I always avoid this word disability. So I'm going to say neurodistinctions. And, in fact, the word disability, it could easily be that somebody needs to come to the site because they have small kids at home and it doesn't have anything to do with a disability. It's just they need a little different kind of flexibility.
Yeah, no, it really doesn't have to be a disability. It's a circumstance.
It's a circumstance. It's something that might need an accommodation, and I need a way to find out what accommodations are available to me.
Yeah. And that's why on our platform, we call it success enablers, because accommodations is very much tied to like the legal process of identifying I have a disability. And you by law are supposed to reasonably give me this accommodation. Whereas we're trying to reframe it as what is going to make you more successful. And some of those things might be an ergonomic chair and some sort of accommodation, but it also may just be leveraging existing investments the company's already made to support the challenge you have.
I like that. Success enablers and people who would benefit from success enablers. That's a great idea. Okay, so I'm going to start using that. But I looked up ADHD and I found a study that said that in the United States, unemployment was a lot higher for people with ADHD. And I think of ADHD as one of the more, as someone who has it, manageable. And incomes were lower, significantly lower among individuals with ADHD compared to controls, regardless of academic achievement or personal characteristics. Really interesting. So you could have a PhD, you could have gone through a PhD program and be as affected in terms of employment by ADHD as anybody else. And so very, very interesting and the statistics were really clear on the effects. And so what do you see as the effects of employee silence about the need for success enablers?
I love that you found that. I'm going to use that stat myself, but I also have ADHD and I make accommodations for myself all the time. I don't even think about them, but if you really think about, I know that after 3, I'm not going to get any really strategic work done. I get up really early to get all that done, and then I'm usually on calls the rest of the day. But I just know how my mind gets like, once I've been on calls all day, I can't stop thinking about what's going on. So I can't sit down and put my head down on something. And so that's an accommodation that I make for myself. And I think that with the data that you presented, I mean, it's very systemic. In education system, if you're diagnosed, how are your teachers and how is that system that you're in, some are much better than others, teaching you how to actually get the benefits of your ADHD and manage the stuff that you need support and help on. And then a lot of it, I'm not surprised by that data, because when you don't learn how to support yourself, especially through your education, there's obviously might be problematic parts of the education system that you have that decreases confidence. It then can start to intersect with other disabilities like anxiety and depression. And so I think what you just said about the suffering in silence, it's not just about you have ADHD and you're not comfortable talking about it. It's that by you not getting the support to be successful, it extrapolates some of the pain points, I think, for many people, in that you have anxiety about going to work and you're stressed and you have lots of other things that start to draw off of that. And so I think talking about it is one thing and raising awareness. And I think for better or worse, this is happening. Mental health became a huge topic of discussion in the workplace. I think this next generation, we need them to plug these skills gaps and the workforce shortage. And they're demanding this. And whether people like it or not yet, it's something we're going to have to solve for. And so I think the suffering in silence is almost the biggest problem, but we also need to meet people where they are. We're not going to just like all of a sudden say, we're so inclusive. Everyone tell us you have ADHD and everyone's just going to do it, which is why we believe our platform is a great gateway into getting more people to self-disclose publicly because they're comfortable with the resources and support you're going to give them. It's like when you just ask someone to self-ID, it's like bringing the bill before dinner. Why am I just going to tell you who I am and what some of my personal details are when I have no idea what you're going to do with that data? And you haven't really shown me what you're going to do to support me and why you're asking for it.
Yeah, and so it's a place that people can do this confidentially until they're ready to not do it confidentially. And so, what are you seeing in terms of the data? And so, I'm going to say it this way. Essentially, what I want to do is I want to know what some of the most predominant issues are so that we can explore what some of the most common accommodations are, and also some of the more surprising things that have come through in terms of the data that companies are not designing for. So the first question is, what are some of the more common situations that require success enablers?
Top accommodations, just in general. I mean, remote work is obviously an accommodation, flexible work schedule. But alongside those, we have been working with Salesforce. They were actually the pilot partner for this product. And within the first 30 days, we collected data on who came in, what were they looking for, what were the pain points. What was really interesting is for them, the top department at their company who came into the platform and was requesting success enablers was the sales department, which all of our assumptions were that this was going to be in the tech department because a
I
lot
would
of
assume
people
that.
talk about neurodiversity and tie it into engineering roles. And so that was really interesting. And the top success enablers were kind of what you would expect apps for anxiety and stress, productivity tools, organizational tools. Those were sort of like the top within that demographic. More broadly, there's the way information is presented. So being able to record meetings or being able to transcribe meetings. Some companies are not allowing different types of meeting tools in and don't want the meetings transcribed, but that is tools that people are needing because some people are auditory learners and some people are visual learners and some people need to read it versus hear it. And so it was a lot around the tools that you use in your everyday. And what was interesting is I think companies are so scared that everyone's just going to want to be remote and not work and be flexible. But those were not the top ones that came in real life. I'd say surprising data we've gotten is across the board, the lowest rated success enabler in our platform on two different occasions was menopause support. That is something nobody is talking about at work, but definitely can affect your work. And so it was interesting to see that when a tool was made anonymous, that was one of the most commonly requested or viewed success enablers and lowest rated because most companies don't have a benefit to support that yet. And then I'd say caregiving support. So caregiving benefits, et cetera, is the top one. So you can see how it spans across traditional disability, but also mental health. Caregiving is, I think, a big pain point in the workplace, whether it's for your own children or aging parent.
So, one of the things that I hadn't thought about before is that different roles are going to create different stressors, and that different stressors might require different success enablers. And so, you take a population, the sales population, social anxiety, that's a very socially exposed role. And so, I can see how different roles, it has nothing to do with the proportion of the population that requires accommodations. The role needs the accommodation. On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's fold.com.
Yeah, so like in engineering, noise canceling headphones are a big one. That's not as commonly seen in a sales role. So you're exactly
Mm-hmm.
right.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Menopause support is just not talked about. I've never heard of that before, by the way.
And there's so many different now innovative benefit offerings that make this type of stuff affordable. When I think about caregiving benefits now, you can pay for like emergency childcare packages for your employees. The cost of that is far less than the cost you're paying, especially as we were talking about for frontline workers if they are absent. So I think what's exciting about what we're doing is you really have to have ROI for these are businesses that are here to support their employees, but they're primarily there to support shareholders. And you really need to be able to tie, if you can tie the ROI and get really good data around that, which is kind of we're in the early stages of doing, I think it's going to be a huge acceleration to this idea that I know that you promote around your employees are a customer and you're obsessed over using AI to create personalized customer experiences, and you need to be equally obsessed with the same thing on the employee side.
Is that an area of particular need? And I can sort of imagine that it might be just because if some strategist is gone for the day, nobody notices. But if the person who's supposed to run the cash register is gone for the day, that's a direct hit to business. Is that a part of the rationale for focusing on frontline?
Yeah, so we started very much in corporate roles. And, a lot of companies have their corporate roles that are very big, but also frontline components. And so we just started to see actually there's even more of a need on the frontline worker side because you don't provide them with health care typically, other benefits. So what is it that you are providing them and how do we serve that up to them? Is it free lunches? Is it just perks? Whatever it is, how can we serve that up to people so they know about it? And then we can collect more data on what are they actually looking for? Because then we can take that information and say, okay, the majority of people are looking for a caregiving benefit, for example. How much do you spend on absenteeism in a year? And how can we correlate that cost? And what can we imply if this percentage of people are talking about caregiving, some sort of flexibility needed around caregiving? How can we imply the savings that you would have if 20% or less people missed work? And what's the cost of actually providing that benefit to your employees? So I think it's almost more needed in many ways from a financial perspective from companies, and they're providing the least to them. And so, how do we collect data so we can identify where they can make the broadest amount of impact on this community?
That makes a lot of sense. I've always been in strategic roles. And it's one of these things where I'm like, I could leave for 3 months and nobody would notice. And if it did result in something bad, you wouldn't be able to tell until like 5 years from now.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely not true in these other roles. Absenteeism, I think that's not something that I have thought about very much in terms of the value of curating the experience of work. And maybe just because my roles have never been ones where me or my team, absenteeism has never been a problem.
I think it's more though under the umbrella of productivity of your people, productivity of your processes. It all comes under that umbrella of how do you make your people more productive and your business more productive. But yeah, I think it was something that stuck out to us when we started thinking about caregiving benefits, actually, which was very common in the corporate world as well, and not something people always want to talk about and share. And so I think that made us think as a startup, we have to start thinking, what's our value proposition? How are we talking and positioning around ROI? And that just became a very clear use case because everyone is experiencing that. And I think a lot of what we're talking about and a lot of the work that you do around workplace design, it's like there's almost the same root problem for all of it, which is you need to be able to personalize your employee offering, your experience at scale to people based on who they are as a person. And then their skills matching to the job is almost secondary. And that's really the root problem when I think about diversity. And it's like, why aren't these people? It's not like they're not applying to your job. They're just not getting set up for success like everyone else. And so I think in a way it's, a very hard problem to solve. But in my mind, I'm like, if we unlock this, it solves a lot of different problems at organizations. And I feel like people have just been in the past treating the symptom of the problem.
What are some great companies doing? Matching need to offering. But I might also extend it to say adapting offerings to need that they learn about. Recently, you and I both know Mike Hess, and Mike Hess came on the show to talk about the Blind Institute of Technology. And one of the things he talked about was Salesforce and how they had made the accessibility of the administrative tools available so that blind people can
Be Salesforce admins.
be Salesforce admins. So there's an overlap between accessibility and accommodation,
Mm-hmm.
for one thing. Are they identical? No. Some accommodations are not accessibility. All accessibility is accommodations.
Yeah. So I was going to use Salesforce is truly the trailblazer, I would say, in this space. We work with them a lot. And I think what they're doing well is their care about the external customers' accessibility needs is mirrored in the internal customer employees' accessibility needs. And I think a lot of companies focus on how are they providing their services or their product in an accessible way to the people who might need accessibility of their customers. So, like what you say outwardly is not actually what you're doing inwardly. I would say that to me is the biggest mind shift. Two things need to be treated the same. And there's so much you can learn from your customers what they needed that then you can understand, like, well, my own employees are probably customers of ours also and may need that. And I think unlocking both sides is really important. And I think in terms of specifics, people who, and I haven't seen a lot of companies yet, but we're working with a lot of them that I think are getting there. People who have ERGs that actually can make change and are collecting impact data and have resources to pilot things, I think that is where companies are really accelerating on meeting the needs.
I'm just going to clarify that acronym. ERGs are employee resource groups.
Yes.
And in fact, this is something Mike Hess pointed out was that Salesforce's, the beginning of them starting to make the administrative tools of Salesforce accessible for the blind was from the blind ERG group.
Yep. We rolled out our first version of our product. We rolled it out with their disability ERG. And then that was a couple of months. And then we rolled it out to all US employees. And we're about to roll it out globally. But we started there. And I think some people, it's like you don't want your ERGs to become a place where everyone just commiserates and vents. You want them to feel like they can actually be strategic in solving some of their problems for the organization. I think that what they've done with Mike, what they're doing with us is a full-blown example of that happening in practice.
At Google, I joined the ERG for people over 50. It was called Greglers. I was in it for about a week and I'm like, it was mostly complaining. And I was like, I'm out. Like,
Yeah.
I admit. And in fact, when I know that some ERGs, when they actually try to make change, meet resistance. Basically, I can see that, which is that here's a group of people who are ready to advocate for themselves.
They're not getting paid to do anything related to the ERG.
Right. They're not being paid for that. They have a passion for it. They're willing to work on it. And there needs to be a sense that they can be successful. And if they find that, they can really contribute to your company.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? We just did a study on the state of workforce planning across our database, and we found that only 33, I think, percent of employees said that their company's external message around diversity and inclusion and all of this stuff matches what their experience is at the company. And I think that is aligned to what you just said, which is like these people are actually wanting to spend their personal time advocating and helping make positive change at the company. And you have the risk of actually taking people who are proactive and wanting to go above and beyond and really disillusioning them if you are not showing progress against the work that they're doing.
It almost seems like ERGs could be curators of what comes up.
We are launching that feature next quarter. So we have this concept of journeys in our platform, and you can customize as an employer any type of journey. So it could be a life event like mom's coming back to work, or it can be disability ERG. But basically, the people who run the ERGs get access to run that space. So they can not only decide what success enablers do we want to promote to our community, et cetera, but they can then start to actually have data on who from our community is coming in and accessing this. What are they looking at? What are the needs they're identifying? It's anonymous because even in ERGs, there's usually Slack channels, but a lot of people say, I'll read this Slack channel, but I'm not comfortable participating yet. And so our lead product manager had a lot of customer interviews that she did this past quarter, which has led to the development of having sort of a portal for ERGs to be able to drive more value to their community, at first leveraging the existing investments that the company already has, and then using that data to better advocate for what people need next. Because that's another thing is if you have more data, more structured data around what people want, it's much easier than as an ERG saying like people are saying this or we did a survey. It's like, no, this is real people coming in and looking for this real tool that we could be providing.
We spoke briefly about where the strongest signal is coming from. I thought that was really interesting that it was coming from sales. That really does surprise me. I really did not expect that. And I don't know if I want to ask this question, but here's what the question I'm going to ask, which is what is the most common need? And I don't think we quite said that. Is anxiety a big hitter? Social anxiety, or is depression the biggest hitter? Or
It's mental health. So all of
it's
those
mental
kind
health
of,
in general?
yeah, fall underneath that.
Got it. So mental health is not ADD, ADHD. Mental health is not autism spectrum. It's anxiety. It's depression. It's all of those things.
Stress, yeah. But these
Stress.
things like usually intersect with other disabilities.
Yeah, I'm sure. That makes a lot of sense. The reason I didn't want to just automatically jump onto the question of what is the biggest hitters is that I suspect that there are orphan issues, which is things that are uncommon, quite severe, still need a way to find success enablers. And for the person who's experiencing them, there absolutely is important. And so, on the one hand, I know we need to invest where the greatest need is, or at least the most common need is. But there's also just this idea that there may be needs that are very hard to predict.
Less common, but more urgent,
Yeah,
essentially. Actually, someone from Google, his name is Christopher Patno, and I believe he runs accessibility or did at Google. I was on a panel with him a couple of years ago, and he said this phrase, which is kind of alluding to what you're talking about, which is if you design for the edge, you get the core for free. And so if you design for all of these outlier use cases, you actually circle around everyone and all of that comes together to help the masses. And a great example is how many tools that we use today started as accessibility tools. Siri, the escalator, the curb cut. Curb cuts were created so that people in wheelchairs could cross the street, and lots of people use them with their strollers, etc. And so there's a term called the curb cut effect. And I think it aligns with what you're saying, which is you may think something is very niche, but oftentimes if you design for those edge case scenarios, you're actually creating a better product or process for everyone.
right. And Although very few people in your organization at any one time may be going through, for instance, the death of a parent, everybody does. And so if you're trying to count a population of people who have that issue, you'd find almost nobody. But that's because everybody passes through it and it's a brief window of that particularly difficult thing.
But the solutions for so bereavement is something that pops up in our platform, and the interesting thing is most of the solutions that we would be recommending for that person is obviously here's your bereavement leave policy and here's how to go enact all of that, but then we're adding in things that are the same accommodations that we just spoke about for the sales team, which is apps for anxiety and stress, EAP. Most companies have EAP programs, which is where you can anonymously call and talk to a therapist. And so, what's interesting is what you're talking about is this one specific thing that happens that really can only happen to people, I guess, once or twice in their life. And so at any specific point in time, there's not 50% of your company going through this, but the same exact tools that you would probably want for that are the same things your everyday salespeople are asking for. And so it's great that there's intersectionality on both sides. There's intersectionality between circumstances, but there's also intersectionality on one resource can actually provide support across 20 different use cases.
I think that ERGs can be seen as annoying because they are often activist and they're asking for things, and companies may not be prepared to give those things. And so there's a way in which I can see this as being a meeting ground for that.
Exactly. It's like guardrails.
Yeah, A, it's a place where ERGs can make a difference. B, it's concrete and it's real and it will help the populations that they want to help. But I do think that really embracing ERGs is something that lots of companies have not successfully done. And the idea that ERGs are an incredible resource as opposed to adjutants.
Yeah. And I think I don't know, I just see this all the time. It's people are like, we have amazing ERGs. We do a panel or we had a dinner or very surface level and celebratory versus action. And I actually think people don't always realize that actually those things can be quite wasteful. But if you actually diverted it to making these ERGs have actionable impact, that benefits your business. Throwing a webinar and celebrating some specific day, you should do just because you do it for many other days. But that's not an ERG strategy. That is baseline table skates. And that's not where the value is going to come in. The value will come in if you can get people who are passionate to direct their energy into making change that benefits both of you.
Yeah, I love that. I ask a set of closing questions at the end of
Love
every show,
it.
which I did not prepare you for at all. The first one is because we talk about work as a product, I ask product marketing questions about your work. And one of them is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? So your work demands something of you and asks something of you. What do you hire it to do for you?
I hire my work to give me the ability to feel like I can make a difference in the world. If I just went to go work in corporate, that job is not fulfilling this broader need that I have to feel like what I am doing every day and the time that I take away from my kids on a daily and weekly basis is actually to make a better place in the world for them. And it aligns both my personal and professional passions. And I think as painful as a startup is, most of the time, it's like you have a North Star always that feels very, for me, synergetic of what I both want personally and professionally.
And when you say a difference, what's an acceptable difference for you? A lot of times people say, I want to make a difference. And I say, would you like to pollute more? And they say, no, that's not what I mean. What's an acceptable difference to you or a the best difference that you can make?
I learned this through my first company got acquired by American Express and I went to go work there. Nothing bad about American Express. It was actually a wonderful place to work, but I really struggle with a lot of decks and saying you're doing something, but like not actually getting the impact. And so I'd say making a difference for me is I can hyper focus on something that I know is a big problem that I can see the light on actually changing. And so there's no like number of people that I think about I want to help, or it's like I find this problem so fascinating. We all act like your professional self and your personal self are two different people. You become a new person at work, and it's like, no, all of our same issues as people present themselves in work in different ways. I find what I'm doing so fascinating because it really makes me a better human by understanding people's needs in a different way outside of the traditional way, which is you're personally servicing people's needs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Because you are running a mission driven company like you are, do you find that companies usually want to hire your company to do what your mission is? Or do sometimes they want to hire a company to do something that is not your mission?
I would say early on, it felt a bit like tick the box with companies. But I think since we have aligned our mission to solving an actual big problem at companies, it is more synergetic now. We have been very, very intentional on, as I said earlier, discussing the ROI and the bottom line impact and the broad benefits and problems that we're solving for companies so that that doesn't become the case. Like if we can get them to buy us for the non altruistic reasons, it means that we will have a better relationship in getting them to do it in the right way. If they believe that this is going to have a financial impact on their business, then they are more likely to trust experts who have already done this before to do it. It's like how you hire E&Y or Deloitte. But if you go in with the altruistic mission within the sale, that's where you get that we can kind of do this, but not this. You're not tying it to the overall mission of their business, which is to make money. I would say, like, conversely, in our own company, because of our mission, we have a lot of people who have come for the mission, but haven't understood that we are a for profit business as well. And so it kind of works both ways, where you're managing the mission is what keeps me going in the hardest of times, but it can also make it harder to raise money because people think because you're an impact company, they set the goalposts further. It can be harder to sell if that's what you're leading with because people are like, oh, this is some DEI thing and it's over there and they have no budget. And so I think that's why we've become very intentional about how we position the product because in reality, we're not going to help people with disabilities if we don't show bottom line benefits. Then it's just a glorified charity.
Mm-hmm. What does your job cost you?
Time with my family and mental load.
Let's explore that actually, mental load. What does that mean?
Even though I can make my schedule flexible to do things with my children and show up for things, I feel like mentally I'm not always present because this is a very demanding job. And so I would say I just carry the mental load home with me, regardless of what's going on. And I think it makes it hard to stay present all the time.
Attention dysregulation disorder, not deficit. So, yes, I get you. Yeah, that's one of the hardest things. It doesn't matter what I do to my calendar. I find what's going on in my head fascinating and unavoidable.
Exactly.
And I don't have a lot of choice about whether I'm focusing internally or externally.
Yeah.
So I get you on that one.
It's almost like an addiction. You're like, it feels better to worry about this than train myself to redirect my thoughts. But I think I've done a lot of different types of experiments on how to help with that. And I think it does get better. Or I feel like I'm leap years away from where I was probably 2 years ago, but I
What
still
were your accommodations?
I don't know, not giving a fuck. Can I say that?
You can.
Uh, I think it's just like, honestly, all the bad experiences that I've had have raised my threshold for shittiness. And I think it gives me peace of mind to be like, well, I got through that. I'm not going to let this other thing distract me while I'm playing with my children. I do think a lot of the accommodations have come through the experiences and proving that I thought something was the end of the world and it wasn't, and moving on and like referring back to that. I do like a lot of when I'm spiraling about something, I'm like, okay, what can I relate this to that is even worse than this, that was totally fine? And then I'm like, okay. And it's like how I get myself to kind of get my system to sort of have a higher threshold for stress, essentially.
Yeah, I did that with social anxiety and speaking situations. I was a boxer and I did taekwondo and judo, and nobody's going to punch me in the face out there. I'm not going to be rendered unconscious during this talk to a bunch of people early. So I
I know,
understand.
I always say when in my first company, there was one of our like first employees who is just the best, would always be like, Charlotte, we are not heart surgeons. No one is going to die today because of this issue. And I was like, you're so right. I like think about that all the time.
Yeah, I did a study of managers at one of the companies I was in, and that was one of the most common refrains. Nobody's going to die. The companies that I worked in, that was true. But if you worked in a hospital, I don't know what you'd do. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show today. I mean, there were some real ahas for me in this. And one of them is the power of ERGs to be a source of design,
Mobilize. Yeah.
to mobilize ERGs as a source of design inspiration. The ability to destigmatize difference by allowing people to start anonymously and confidentially to explore that. And I would also imagine that more of the present day, the newest people into the workforce are coming from a place where they may have been diagnosed, but there are people who are older who have never been diagnosed and who actually, by being able to go to a platform where they can ask questions anonymously, might find a diagnosis.
Or at least find support for
Support.
the challenge. People think of this next generation as having all these needs, but actually, your whole company has these needs. It's just they're more vocal about them. So I think the example you just gave is right on the spot.
More vocal and more aware.
Yeah. They know their rights way more.
And they have been diagnosed in more cases.
Yeah.
There's a whole language that younger generations have to speak about this that older generations don't.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.